My name is Sophia Carter, and I'm a psychology major in my third year at Crestwood University. It all started when I noticed a strange addition to my course schedule. It wasn't just the name of the professor, Professor Larkin, that caught me off guard. I had never even heard of him before. But what really threw me off was the classroom number. It was listed as being in the far end of an old building, one I'd never even noticed before. Curiosity got the better of me, and instead of just ignoring it, I decided to check it out. The first thing I noticed when I arrived was how isolated the place felt. I'd walked through this campus hundreds of times, but I'd never ventured to this part. The hallway was dead quiet, like the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. It wasn't the usual hustle and bustle of a university, and I found it unsettling. But I pressed on, telling myself that I was just overthinking things. I mean, how bad could it really be? When I finally found the room, the door was slightly ajar. There was no noise coming from inside, no signs of life at all. I figured I might have been early, but the clock on the wall said otherwise. A strange chill crept over me as I pushed the door open wider. To my surprise, the room was empty, except for a single man standing at the front, facing the board. His back was to me, and for a second, I hesitated. Something about the way he stood there was off. I took a seat near the back, hoping others would show up soon. But they didn't. No one did. I was the only one there, and the professor didn't even turn around to acknowledge me at first. I cleared my throat, trying to get his attention, and that's when he finally turned to face me. His eyes were dark, almost lifeless, and though his expression was neutral, it made my skin crawl. "Welcome, Ms. Carter," he said, like he'd been expecting me all along. The first lecture wasn't like any class I'd taken before. There was something odd about the way he spoke, like every word was carefully chosen to unsettle me, and it worked. By the end of it, I was fighting the urge to bolt out of there, but I stayed, trying to convince myself that this was just a weird professor with an even weirder teaching style. I'd heard stories about eccentric professors before. Maybe this was one of them, but the whole thing felt off. The atmosphere, the room itself, it didn't feel like part of the campus. I remember thinking, why am I the only one here? I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd made a mistake by coming. Something about that room, that professor, it didn't belong at Crestwood. I decided then and there that I'd drop the class first chance I got. But little did I know, that wasn't going to be as easy as I thought. I went back the following week, hoping that maybe I'd just shown up on an off day before. But the moment I stepped into that room again, the same eerie feeling washed over me. It was still just me and Professor Larkin. The classroom was dimly lit, like the university had forgotten about this section entirely. The air felt colder than it should, like the room was stuck in some kind of permanent chill. I thought maybe I was overthinking things, but every instinct in my body was telling me to leave. I took my usual seat, towards the back, but this time I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I scanned the room, but there was no one else there. Just the professor, staring at me with those unsettling eyes. He didn't smile, didn't give me any indication that he even cared I was there. But his gaze never left me. It was like he was studying me, waiting for me to do something, though I had no idea what. The lecture started again, just as strange as before. His voice had this monotonous quality, droning on and on about topics that I couldn't quite follow. It was almost like the words were designed to hypnotize, to trap me in that cold, dim room. I tried to focus, but the walls seemed to close in the longer I sat there. My breath became shallow, and for the life of me, I couldn't understand why I hadn't left yet. At one point, I glanced down at my phone to check the time, but my screen wouldn't turn on. The battery was fully charged, but it wouldn't respond. I looked around the room, wondering if maybe there was something wrong with the signal, but then I realized there weren't even any windows in this classroom. That hadn't struck me as odd the first time, but now it did. It was like the room was sealed off from the rest of the world. As the lecture dragged on, I noticed that the professor never once looked at the chalkboard or any notes. He just stared at me, his dark eyes unblinking, as if I was the only thing in that room that mattered. I felt like a mouse being watched by a snake, and no matter how much I wanted to leave, my legs wouldn't cooperate. It was as if I was glued to the chair, trapped by his gaze. The longer I sat there, the more I felt that something was terribly wrong with this room, with him. I couldn't explain it, but it was like the air itself was thicker, almost suffocating. My heart raced, and I could feel a cold sweat forming on my forehead. I knew I had to leave, but every time I considered getting up, something held me back. It was like the room itself didn't want me to leave. When the lecture finally ended, I bolted for the door without a word. I didn't even look back to see if Professor Larkin was watching me leave. All I knew was that I had to get out of that room as fast as I could. But even as I rushed down the empty hallway, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't really left that room behind. Something from that class still clung to me. In the days that followed, I tried to push the strange experience to the back of my mind. Maybe it was just a creepy professor, or maybe I was overreacting because of the eerie vibe in that part of campus. But things took a darker turn when I started noticing that the names on the class roster were disappearing. At first, I thought it was just a glitch. I'd never even seen these students in class, so maybe they had dropped the course without saying anything. But then, I started asking around, just to be sure. I went to a few friends who I knew had signed up for the class and asked them if they'd attended yet. The weird thing, they didn't remember ever registering for it. One of my friends, Rachel, who I was sure had been in that lecture with me, looked at me like I was crazy. She said she'd never even heard of Professor Larkin, let alone attended his class. That's when the pit in my stomach started to grow. Over the next few weeks, fewer and fewer students were listed on the online portal. I checked every day, and each time another name was gone, and not just from the class, gone entirely. Their profiles were wiped clean. It was as if they'd never existed at Crestwood. I started to wonder if I was losing my mind. How could these students just vanish without a trace? No one else seemed to notice, and the university administration was no help. They said the roster had always been the way it was. I couldn't ignore the signs anymore. Something was happening to the students who entered that classroom, and it wasn't a coincidence. One by one, they were disappearing, and the only common thread was Professor Larkin. But how could I explain that to anyone? It wasn't like I could just walk into the dean's office and say, "Hey, I think my professor is making students vanish into thin air." They'd think I'd lost it. Maybe I had. But the worst part? No one seemed to care. It was as if the students who vanished had never really existed in the first place. No one asked about them. No one searched for them. They were just gone. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that it was only a matter of time before I became the next name to disappear. The classroom was always empty now, except for me. I was the only one left. It didn't take long for the realization to hit me. I was alone. Completely alone. No one else seemed to be attending the lectures anymore, and each time I entered that room, the emptiness felt more oppressive. Professor Larkin never acknowledged the absence of other students. He just continued his bizarre, unsettling lectures like nothing was wrong. But I knew better. I knew something was terribly, terribly wrong. The thought consumed me. What had happened to those students? Where had they gone? And why wasn't I already gone like them? The questions gnawed at me day and night. I could feel the tension building, like I was on the edge of something I couldn't fully comprehend. By the time I realized I was the last one left, panic had already taken root. I knew I had to drop the class, get out while I still could. But when I logged into the university portal to remove it from my schedule, something strange happened. Every time I tried to click drop, the page would freeze. It was like the system itself wouldn't let me go. No matter how many times I refreshed, the class stayed locked in place, and the frustration gnawed at me. At first, I thought it was a technical glitch. I mean, it's not uncommon for the university systems to act up, especially around midterms. But after a few days of trying, it became clear this wasn't just a tech issue. Every other course on my schedule worked fine. I could add, drop, or adjust them with no problem. But this class, this one with Professor Larkin, refused to let me go. It felt like I was trapped in more ways than one. The thought of going back to that classroom terrified me. But no matter how hard I tried to avoid it, something inside me, something beyond my control, kept pulling me back. It was like a magnetic force, tugging at my mind, urging me to return. I fought it for as long as I could, skipping lectures and making excuses to myself. But the pull grew stronger, and soon I found myself standing outside that door again, heart pounding in my chest. The final straw came when, one evening, I heard a knock at my dorm door. At first it was soft, almost like someone gently tapping. I ignored it, assuming it was just one of my friends. But then the knocking grew louder, more insistent. My stomach dropped as I realized no one else was supposed to be here. My roommates were out for the night. I stared at the door, my hand frozen halfway to the knob, and I just knew. I knew who was on the other side. It was him. I didn't need to see his face to know. The knocking continued, rhythmic and relentless, until I backed away from the door entirely. I couldn't open it. I wouldn't. Every fiber of my being screamed at me not to. I pressed my back against the wall, holding my breath, waiting for the knocking to stop. But it didn't. It went on for what felt like hours, until finally there was silence. But that silence was worse than the knocking. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every creak of the floor, every rustle of the wind outside made my heart race. I knew he was still out there, watching, waiting. The next day, I made up my mind. I was done. I wouldn't go back to that class no matter what. But as much as I tried to convince myself that it was over, that I could just walk away, a part of me knew it wasn't that simple. Something about that class, that professor, wasn't finished with me yet. Even though I hadn't opened the door that night, I felt like I had let something in. After that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The air around me felt heavier, like a constant weight pressing down on my chest. I decided to go to the university administration to get some answers. I figured if I couldn't drop the class online, I'd do it in person. So I walked into the office, fully prepared to explain the situation. But when I mentioned Professor Larkin, the woman behind the desk gave me a confused look. "There's no Professor Larkin here," she said, flipping through some files on her desk. I froze. How could that be? I'd been attending his class for weeks. I insisted, asking her to check again, but she showed me the records. There was no one by that name employed at Crestwood University. It didn't make any sense. I'd seen him, spoken to him. I was still listed for his course on my schedule, but somehow, officially, he didn't exist. That was when the dread really started to settle in. If he didn't work here, if there was no record of him, then who, or what, had I been sitting in front of all this time? I left the office in a daze, my mind spinning with questions that had no answers. As I walked back across campus, the buildings around me felt unfamiliar, almost like I was seeing them through a distorted lens. I couldn't trust anything anymore. Not the school, not my own memory. A few days later, I decided to pass by the old corridor where Larkin's classroom was, just to see if it was still there. I don't know what I was expecting. Maybe the room would be locked up, or maybe it would be gone entirely. But when I got there, the door was open. Not wide open, but just enough to see inside. My heart raced as I peeked in. The classroom was empty, just as it had been when I'd first found it. No desks, no lights on, just an eerie, quiet space. But then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of a lecture being given. I couldn't see anyone inside, but I could hear him. Larkin's voice, droning on in that strange, unsettling way he always did. It was like the sound was coming from somewhere deep within the walls themselves. My skin prickled as I realized that, despite everything, the class was still happening. But it wasn't just a class, it was a trap. A lure for students like me who wandered too far into the forgotten corners of the university. I backed away from the door, my pulse pounding in my ears. Part of me wanted to run, but another part of me was frozen in place. It was like the room was daring me to step inside, to join whatever was still happening in there. But I couldn't, not after everything I'd been through. I turned and walked away, but even as I put distance between myself and that corridor, I could still hear his voice, faint but clear, echoing in the back of my mind. Days passed, and though I avoided that part of campus, I couldn't escape the feeling that Larkin was still watching me. I'd see shadows move out of the corner of my eye or hear faint footsteps behind me when no one was there. I knew deep down that it wasn't over. He was still there, still waiting, and it was only a matter of time before someone else made the same mistake I did. It all started on a quiet Wednesday evening. My name's Aaron Miller, and I was a third-year biology student at Westbrook University. You know that old science wing on campus? The one everyone avoids because it's been shut down for years? Well, I decided to go exploring there one night. I've always had this curiosity, you know. I'd heard some weird rumors about it. People saying they'd seen things, heard strange noises, the usual creepy campus legends, but something about them stuck with me. I don't know what came over me that night. Maybe it was the cold air that made me feel like I needed to figure out what was happening there. The whole wing was dark and felt abandoned, like no one had stepped foot in it for years. You could almost feel the history hanging in the air, but not in a comforting way. The deeper I went, the colder it got, like the temperature was dropping the closer I got to something. My gut told me to turn back, but you know how it is when curiosity gets the best of you. I should have left right then, but when I saw that one door slightly open, my feet kept moving. The lab wasn't even on any of the building's blueprints, but there it was, hidden like it wasn't meant to be found. The door was just a crack open, like it was waiting for someone to step inside. And I did. Yeah, I know it sounds stupid now, but in the moment it felt like I had no choice, like something was pulling me in. As soon as I crossed the threshold, everything felt off. I mean, the air got colder, like way colder, and I swear I could hear this faint hum, like machinery running, but nothing was turned on. The equipment looked ancient, like it hadn't been touched in decades, yet it was clean, almost too clean. The kind of clean that makes your skin crawl because it doesn't make sense. How could something this old be so pristine? But it was the feeling that got me the most. You ever walk into a room and just feel like you're not alone? Like someone, or something, is watching you, but you can't see them? That's exactly what it was like. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that I was imagining things, but deep down I knew I wasn't. Something was there. I just didn't know what yet. I looked around the lab, trying to figure out what this place was, why it wasn't on any map. I started taking notes, snapping pictures. But the more I stayed, the more I felt uneasy, like the room itself didn't want me there. I thought about leaving, but something kept pulling me back. And that's when things started getting really weird. The moment I stepped further into the lab, everything shifted. At first, it was subtle. The flickering lights overhead made me think it was just old wiring or maybe a power issue, but it quickly became clear that it wasn't anything that simple. The walls themselves seemed to warp, like the entire place was bending and twisting, but just enough to mess with my head. It was like reality itself was shifting, and I couldn't find my footing. I decided to leave. I'd seen enough, right? But every door I tried, every hallway I went down, they all led me back to the same damn room. At first I thought I was just getting turned around. It's an old building after all, and it was dark. But after the third or fourth time ending up back in that lab, I started to panic. No matter how many times I walked down that hallway, the same lab was staring me in the face when I opened the door. I kept telling myself it was just a trick of the mind. I hadn't eaten in hours, and maybe I was just tired. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. Time itself felt wrong, like it was stretching, warping in a way that I couldn't explain. It was as if hours had passed, but when I checked my phone, it showed only minutes had gone by. My body felt exhausted, but my watch barely moved. And that's when I realized I was trapped. The worst part? I wasn't just physically trapped. It was like time had no meaning anymore. I'd walk for what felt like hours, only to find myself standing right where I started. It didn't matter what I did, run, walk, even close my eyes and pray for it to stop. I couldn't escape. Every time I opened a door, every time I turned a corner, that same lab was waiting for me, as if it was mocking me. I don't know when it hit me, but at some point, I realized I wasn't just lost. This place, whatever it was, had taken control of time itself, I was stuck in some kind of loop, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't break free. I'd hear the faintest sounds, footsteps maybe, or whispers. But when I turned around, there was nothing there. Just the cold, empty hallways and that damn lab waiting for me. Panic set in fast. I tried to keep calm, telling myself there had to be a way out. I mean, I'd gotten in, right? There had to be a way out. But every door was the same. Every turn led me right back. I was losing time, and worse, I was losing myself. The lines between reality and whatever this was, they blurred until I couldn't tell what was real anymore. And that's when the fear really sank in. It wasn't long before I started to feel it, this presence, something watching me. I couldn't see anything, but you know that gut feeling when you just know you're not alone? Yeah, that was it. At first, I thought maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I mean, I'd been stuck in that loop for who knows how long, so it made sense that my brain was freaking out. But this was different. It felt real, like there was something there with me, lurking just out of sight. The first sign that something was truly wrong came when I checked my watch. The damn thing was ticking backward. I stared at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but no matter how much I blinked or shook it, the second hand just kept spinning in reverse. It was like time itself was unraveling around me. That's when I realized, whatever had trapped me here, it was messing with more than just the space. It was playing with time too, warping it, bending it to its will. And then there were the reflections. I'd walk past windows or look into the shiny surface of the lab equipment, and my reflection would just disappear. 1 second, I'd see myself, but the next, nothing. Just empty space where I should have been. It was like I wasn't even there anymore. Or worse, like something was erasing me, bit by bit, until there was nothing left. That's when the whispers started. They weren't loud, just soft, subtle enough to make me question whether I was really hearing them. But I knew. They were there, in the back of my mind, telling me that escape was impossible, that this place, this thing had me now. And the more I tried to fight it, the stronger the presence became. It was like it was feeding off my fear, growing more powerful with every step I took, every thought I had about getting out. The worst part was that every time I thought I'd found an exit, every time I thought maybe I'd outsmarted it, I'd be pulled back. It wasn't a gentle tug either. It was like being yanked by an invisible force, dragged back into that lab no matter how hard I resisted. My heart would race, my breath would catch, and in an instant, I'd be right back where I started, standing in that cold, empty room with no way out. By this point, I was convinced I wasn't alone. Something was there, toying with me, and I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. Its presence pressed down on me, heavy and suffocating, like it was tightening its grip on my mind, bending reality just to watch me break. And that's when I realized the truth. I wasn't just lost. I was a prisoner, and whatever this thing was, it wasn't going to let me go. Days, weeks. Honestly, I couldn't tell anymore. Time had completely lost its meaning by then. I'd wake up, or at least I think I did, and everything around me would look the same. The lab, the hallways, the doors that never led anywhere but back to where I started. My phone was useless. The battery had died long ago, but even when it worked, no one answered. It was like the outside world had vanished, and I was the only one left. That's when the hallucinations started. At first, I thought I was seeing things, just flashes out of the corner of my eye. I'd see a classmate walking by in a reflection or hear their voice echoing down the hall, calling my name. But every time I turned around, there was no one there, just silence. It was maddening. I started questioning everything. Was I even awake? Or was this some kind of nightmare that I couldn't wake up from? I remember pounding on the walls, screaming, just trying to hear something, anything, other than my own voice. The entity wasn't just messing with my surroundings anymore. It was in my head. I could feel it, twisting my thoughts, making me doubt what was real and what wasn't. There were moments when I'd catch a glimpse of myself in a reflection, but it wasn't me. My eyes looked wrong, empty. like I wasn't really there anymore. Like whatever I was seeing wasn't me at all, but something else wearing my face. It was like the entity was trying to push me out of my own mind. I started hearing whispers, but this time they were louder, clearer. They weren't just in the background anymore. They were in my head, telling me things, feeding me lies, or maybe truths. I couldn't tell anymore. My thoughts weren't my own, and the more I tried to hold on to reality, the more it slipped through my fingers. I was spiraling, and I knew it. The entity had me exactly where it wanted me, and it wasn't going to let go. At some point, I stopped trying to fight it. What was the point? Every time I tried to escape, I'd end up right back where I started. Every time I thought I'd found a way out, it would pull me back, harder, faster, like it was punishing me for even trying. It was like I was trapped in a never-ending maze, and no matter what I did, I couldn't break free. My only company was the silence, the cold, and that oppressive presence that never left. I don't know how long it took for the despair to set in, but when it did, it hit me hard. I'd sit in that lab staring at the walls, trying to remember what it felt like to be outside, to be free. But even those memories started to fade. The longer I stayed there, the more disconnected I felt from the outside world, like it was just a distant dream. And that's when I realized I wasn't just losing track of time, I was losing myself. Eventually, I found what I thought was an escape. It's hard to explain, but after what felt like months of being trapped in that endless loop, I stumbled upon a door that hadn't been there before. At first I hesitated. After all, every other door had led me back to the same place. But something about this one was different. The air felt lighter, and I could hear faint noises, sounds from outside, from the real world. My heart raced as I pushed it open, and for the first time in what seemed like forever, I stepped out into the fresh air. But something wasn't right. The campus was the same, yet off. The sun was setting, casting everything in this eerie orange glow, and there was this strange stillness that I couldn't shake. As I walked around, I noticed small details that didn't add up. The buildings looked slightly different, like they'd been renovated or altered in subtle ways. There were new faces on campus, people I didn't recognize, and when I tried to talk to them, they just stared. It was like I didn't exist to them. I checked my phone, hoping to get my bearings, but when I looked at the date, my stomach dropped. Months had passed. Months. It was as if I had been erased from time while I was trapped in that lab. My friends, my professors, they had moved on. I didn't exist in their world anymore. I wasn't dead, but I wasn't alive in the way I remembered either. It felt like I had been spat out of reality, only half of me making it back. The worst part, though, was the feeling that I hadn't truly escaped. Everywhere I went, I could feel it, the entity, lurking just out of sight. I'd catch glimpses of it in shadows, in reflections, always watching. It hadn't let me go, not really. It was still with me, hanging over me like a dark cloud, waiting for the right moment to pull me back in. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just another part of the loop, that I wasn't actually free. I tried to go back to normal life, but nothing felt right. The campus didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like I was being watched at all times, even when I was alone. The entity was still there, lurking in the corners of my vision, in the cracks of reality. I could feel it in my dreams too, pulling at me, dragging me back to that lab. No matter how far I went, no matter what I did, it was always there, waiting. I left Westbrook University not long after that. I couldn't stay. Every day was a reminder of what had happened, of what I had barely escaped. But even after leaving, I knew deep down that the entity hadn't given up. It was patient. It could wait. And as I sit here now telling you this, I can feel it still, just out of reach, watching, waiting for the next student to wander too close to that abandoned wing. Because I know one thing for certain, it's not over. Not for me, and definitely not for them. You know, when people talk about those nights that change everything, they're usually talking about a wild party or a bad breakup. For me, it was a party too, but not the fun kind. My name's Olivia Woods, junior at Blackridge University, psychology major. Not that any of that really matters in the grand scheme of what happened that night. I still remember it like it was yesterday. It was supposed to be just another crazy night at the Delta Psi house. You know, the one with the bad rep for throwing the wildest parties on campus? Yeah, that one. But this one was different. The house itself was already infamous for all kinds of rumors. You'd hear people say it was haunted or that something dark happened there years ago. I never believed in that kind of stuff. Honestly, I thought it was all nonsense, you know? Just stories to make the place sound cooler or creepier, depending on who you asked. But that night, as soon as I walked in, something just felt off. The usual buzz of excitement was there, sure, but there was this underlying tension. Like everyone was trying to ignore something lurking in the corners. Maybe it was because midterms were around the corner, or maybe it was just nerves. I remember shrugging it off, thinking it was just me being paranoid. I'd had a long week after all, but there was something in the air, something heavy, like the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something. Still, I pushed the thought away, grabbed a drink, and tried to relax. After all, what could possibly go wrong at a frat party, right? I stuck with my usual group, keeping things light, talking about the most random stuff. But as the night went on, I couldn't shake this weird feeling. It was like the house was watching us. Sounds crazy, right? I know. But every now and then, I'd catch myself glancing at the basement door. It just stood there, closed, as if it was daring someone to open it. I wasn't the only one who noticed. A few of my friends joked about it, saying it was where the real fun happened. Looking back now, I wish I had left then. I think what really set everything into motion was the music. At one point, it just stopped. Like, completely. There was this moment where everyone kind of paused, like we were all waiting for something to happen. When the music finally came back, it didn't feel the same. The whole vibe had shifted. People were still dancing, still drinking, but there was this weird edge to everything. The laughter felt forced, the smiles didn't quite reach their eyes, and that basement door, it stayed shut, but I swear, it felt like it was watching us too. The strangest part, no one was talking about it. Everyone acted like it was just another night, but I could feel it. There was something wrong, something none of us could see, but it was there, lurking in the shadows, just waiting. I thought maybe it was just the pressure of the semester getting to me, making me imagine things, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. I could feel it creeping in, that sense that something terrible was about to happen. And honestly, it did. Just not in the way I ever could have imagined. Looking back now, I wish I had listened to my instincts. I wish I had just walked out that door and never looked back. But I didn't. None of us did. We stayed thinking we were invincible, that the stories were just stories. But that night, in that house, everything changed. We woke something up, something dark, something hungry, and once it was awake, it wasn't going to stop. It's still out there, I'm sure of it, waiting. You know how every party has that one moment where things go from fun to just plain weird? Well, that moment came when someone suggested we play the game. It was supposed to be this old tradition at Delta Psi, something they did at every big party. Honestly, it sounded like just another drinking game at first. But when they started talking about summoning spirits, I laughed it off. I mean, come on, summoning spirits at a frat party? It sounded ridiculous. But my friends? Oh, they were all in. Peer pressure, right? They brought out this dusty old book from the back of one of the frat guys' rooms. No one knew where it came from, and honestly, it looked like it belonged in a museum, not a college house. The pages were yellowed, and the writing. It wasn't in English, that's for sure. But we were all a little buzzed, and everyone thought it'd be fun to see what would happen. Someone made a joke about how it was probably just a prop left over from some prank years ago. But that book, there was something about it that felt wrong. I couldn't put my finger on it, but holding it made my skin crawl. The guys leading the game said it was simple. We'd go down to the basement, form a circle, and read some lines from the book. It was all in good fun, right? So, despite the uneasy feeling gnawing at the back of my mind, I went along with it. Down to the basement we went, About 10 of us, laughing and joking like this was just some stupid college prank. The basement was dimly lit, the only light coming from a couple of flickering candles. It felt colder down there, but I brushed it off as just being underground. When the reading started, it was all laughs. People were messing up the strange words, stumbling over the pronunciation. But as we continued, the air began to change. I swear, it was like the room itself was holding its breath. The laughter died down, replaced by this uncomfortable silence. We were still sitting in a circle, but no one was making eye contact. It felt like we were waiting for something to happen, like the punchline of a bad joke that never came. Then, out of nowhere, one of the candles blew out. No breeze, no draft, just out. The room got colder, and suddenly, I wasn't laughing anymore. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel the tension rise in the room. Someone tried to relight the candle, but their hands were shaking too much to get it done. And that's when I felt it, that sensation of being watched, not by the people in the room, but by something else, something I couldn't see, but I knew it was there. The game was over at that point. Everyone tried to laugh it off, make jokes about how creepy it had gotten, but I could tell I wasn't the only one who felt it. There was this unspoken agreement that we needed to get out of there, and fast. We all headed back upstairs, leaving the basement and the book behind. But even as we rejoined the party, something lingered. That feeling of being watched. It didn't go away. If anything, it got stronger. I couldn't shake it. The whole rest of the night I felt like something was following me, watching me from the shadows. It wasn't just paranoia either. There was this heaviness in the air, like the house itself had woken up. And the weirdest part? No one was really talking about it. We all just went back to partying, pretending like nothing had happened. But deep down, I think we all knew that we'd messed up. We'd woken something up, and now there was no putting it back to sleep. The morning after the party, everything felt off. You know that feeling when you wake up after a long night out and something just doesn't sit right? That was me, but worse. I remember checking my phone, expecting a flood of texts about how crazy the night had been, but instead there was silence. I didn't think much of it until I realized Jake hadn't texted either. He was usually the first one to joke about the night's chaos, but his name wasn't even popping up in the group chat. Weird, right? At first I thought maybe he'd hooked up with someone or crashed somewhere else, but hours went by and still no word. It wasn't like Jake to just disappear like that. We texted a few other friends who had been at the party, but no one had seen him after we left the basement. His bed back at the dorm was untouched, his stuff still there. The more we searched, the more this sick feeling started building in my stomach. It wasn't like Jake to just vanish without telling someone. The last place any of us had seen him? The basement. By the second day, everyone was talking about it. Jake wasn't the only one who had gone missing. A couple of other people from the party hadn't been seen since that night either. People started to freak out. Campus security got involved and the rumors started flying. Some people said Jake had just skipped town. Others joked that it was a prank. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever we had done in that basement had something to do with it. Every time I thought about it, I got this heavy feeling in my chest, like I was being pulled back to that moment when the candle went out. It wasn't long before pictures from the party started circulating. People were posting all over social media, trying to piece together what had happened. That's when things got really strange. In some of the photos, you could see Jake, mid-laugh or drink in hand. But in others, it was like he was staring straight at the camera, terrified, like he knew something was coming for him. His expression was completely different from the carefree Jake we all knew. It was chilling. The campus started buzzing with more than just gossip. Flyers went up for the missing students, and you couldn't walk past a dorm without hearing someone whispering about the disappearances. The police were around more often, asking questions, but no one had answers. It was like Jake and the others had just vanished into thin air. And the weird part? No one wanted to talk about the basement. It was like this unspoken rule. We all knew something was wrong down there, but saying it out loud made it too real, too dangerous. My mind kept going back to that night, replaying everything in slow motion. The game, the candle, the strange feeling that something was watching us. It all came rushing back, and every time I thought about it, the fear tightened its grip. I couldn't sleep, couldn't focus on anything but the possibility that we had unleashed something. Jake was gone, and I knew deep down that it had something to do with what we'd done. The real question was, who would be next? I couldn't shake it anymore. The more people disappeared, the more I realized it all pointed back to that basement. No one else wanted to admit it, but I knew. There was something down there, something we'd disturbed, and I was sure that whatever it was, it had taken Jake and the others. I remember pacing in my dorm room, trying to convince myself that I was just overreacting, but that sick feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. Eventually, I made a decision I wasn't sure I'd survive. I had to go back to the Delta Psi house. Getting in wasn't hard. The fraternity house was almost always open, but it was quiet. Too quiet. The party vibe was long gone, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to wrap around the place like a shroud. I walked through the halls, hearing only the sound of my own footsteps, echoing like a warning. The basement door was still there, just as I remembered, and the second I saw it, my heart started racing. I wasn't ready for what I was about to face, but I knew I had no choice. When I opened the door, the air hit me like a wall, cold, damp, and thick with that same heaviness I'd felt the night of the party. It was like the basement had been waiting for me, like it knew I'd come back. I took the stairs one at a time, my breath quickening with each step. The dim light barely illuminated the room, and for a second, I thought maybe I'd imagined everything, but then I saw them. Strange symbols, scratched into the walls. They weren't there before. I was sure of it. The lines twisted and pulsed, almost like they were alive, feeding off the darkness in the room. That's when I felt it. That same presence from before, the one that had watched us during the game. Only now, it wasn't just watching. It was there, in the room with me, moving in the shadows just out of sight. My heart pounded in my chest, every instinct telling me to run, but I couldn't. I was frozen, standing in the middle of the basement, staring at the walls, knowing I'd made a huge mistake coming back here alone. The silence was unbearable, like the room was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A dark shape, barely visible in the shadows, but unmistakable. It wasn't human. It was something else, something twisted and unnatural, feeding on the fear that was now coursing through my veins. I stumbled back, my legs shaking, my throat dry as I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I don't know how I made it out of there. 1 second, I was standing face to face with whatever that thing was, and the next, I was running up the stairs, my feet barely touching the ground. The basement door slammed behind me, but even then, I could feel it. That presence, still there, waiting. It hadn't followed me up, but I knew it could have. I don't know why it let me go, but I wasn't naive enough to think I was safe. I ran all the way back to my dorm, not stopping until I was behind the locked door. My mind was racing, replaying everything I'd just seen. The symbols, the shadows, the thing that had been down there. It was real, all of it. And I knew now, without a doubt, that it wasn't done. Whatever we'd woken up that night in the basement, it was still hungry. After that night in the basement, I thought maybe things would calm down. Maybe, just maybe, whatever it was would go back to sleep and the disappearances would stop. But I was wrong. The very next morning, more students were missing. The police were swarming the campus and Delta Psi had been officially shut down. The house was boarded up, with no one allowed inside. But deep down, I knew the entity wasn't trapped inside those walls. It was out, and it wasn't going to stop until it got what it wanted. More fear, more chaos. I tried to warn people. I went to the campus security, the police, anyone who would listen. But no one believed me. They all thought it was just some elaborate prank gone wrong, that the missing students had just run off. But I knew better. I could feel it. The presence was still there, lurking in the shadows of the campus, watching, waiting. Every night I'd wake up in a cold sweat, feeling like it was just outside my window, waiting for the right moment to strike. The tension on campus was unbearable. Everyone was on edge, scared, but no one really understood why. The disappearances were chalked up to coincidence, but I knew the truth. It wasn't just a coincidence. It was deliberate. The entity was picking us off one by one, feeding off the fear it had created. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was next, that it was only a matter of time before it came for me. I'd see shadows in the corner of my eye, hear strange whispers in the dead of night. I couldn't sleep, couldn't think straight. It was always there, just out of sight. I knew what I had to do. I had to go back. The thought of facing it again terrified me, but I didn't have a choice. If I didn't confront it, more people would disappear, and it wouldn't stop until it had taken everyone. So I went back to the Delta Psi house, even though it had been boarded up. Breaking in wasn't hard. The place was a ghost town. The second I stepped inside, that familiar chill washed over me. It was like walking straight into the heart of the storm. The silence was deafening, and I knew without a doubt that it was waiting for me. The basement was even darker this time, colder too. The symbols on the walls had spread, covering every inch of the space, pulsating with a life of their own. I could feel the entity before I saw it, a heavy presence pressing down on me, suffocating me. And then it appeared. It wasn't a shadow anymore. It had taken form, twisted and grotesque, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. I don't know how to describe it. Part human, part nightmare, like something pulled straight out of the deepest corners of my fear. It moved towards me slowly, deliberately, like it was savoring the moment. I was frozen, paralyzed with terror, but I knew I had to do something. I couldn't let it win. So I screamed. I screamed as loud as I could, hoping that maybe, just maybe, someone would hear me. But the sound seemed to die in the air, swallowed by the darkness around us. The entity stopped for a moment, tilting its head like it was listening, then continued its slow, deliberate approach. I don't know how I escaped. It's all a blur, really. One second I was standing there, face to face with the creature, and the next, I was outside, gasping for air. The Delta Psi house loomed behind me, dark and silent, but I knew it wasn't over. The entity was still in there, waiting for the next group of unsuspecting students to wake it up again. And this time, I don't think anyone will make it out alive.